reason that I'm here is because the club is seeking change.
He said, well, whether you come or not, you're going to see a completely different Spurs team under me.
My hope and my desire and what I'm going to try and do is give our supporters hope and belief that we're going to embark on something special.
Welcome into the Tottenham Depot. I am your host, Andrew. This is episode 224. We've got a lot to talk about today, despite the men being away on an international break. We've got a women's match to talk about, some pro-rel news throughout the world of soccer this week, and Mauricio Pochettino is making some news as well. That's a blast from the past that I did not expect to be having on the pod this week. We've got Caroline alongside to talk about it all with. She is at CG Stefco. Caroline, how are you on this fine Sunday?
Despite the result, pretty good overall. My USL team is good again, so that's been really refreshing. And, like I said prior to recording, there are only 5 more games in which Spurs Women can disappoint us this season, so it's all good.
It's coming down to it for sure. Scott is also here. He is at Scott G. Bird. Scott, how are you this week?
I'm good. I'm a little more tired than usual. You both know this, but my wife and I welcomed a beautiful baby boy into the world on Monday, which is St. Patrick's Day, baby. But it's been a whirlwind of a week. Not much sleep. Lots of March Madness basketball from the couch, but doing very well. I'm probably got the most sleep I've gotten since he came last night, so that was super helpful. But we'll be powering through.
We are so elated for both you and Kat, and the newest Spurs fan is the newest member of the Depot is among us, and we love that for you guys. It is so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, and his name is Luka Copano Bird. Not named after Luka Modric, but I am very determined to make sure that he becomes the next Luka Modric. So we will see.
Only a few more years he'll be in the academy. We know that's the case. Guys, let's start with Spurs Women away to West Ham this morning, which did not go the right way. It is yet another defeat. I don't know where we go from here when it comes to talking about Spurs Women. It's a 5th straight defeat in the WSL, a 6th straight overall. They have scored 1 goal, it feels like, in these last stretch of games. Caroline, this was a weird lineup. It was a little bit of a change. Obviously, we know Beth England's still out with the injury, but this was a lot of rotation for it didn't seem like it needed to be. There's still some players coming back, I know, and wanting to get their fitness, but this was a match that I thought we all knew was going to produce goal scoring, but it only produced 2, and they were both in favor of West Ham. What was your take on this lineup, first of all, before we kind of dig into the way that the match went?
I mean, I just don't really understand this constant rotation that Robert Villaham has been doing, because it's not like we have a lot of games left in the schedule. We're not playing midweeks. There's really no sort of fitness reason for it. And it's just frustrating because I feel like we spent the first half of the season wondering, why are these underperforming players continuing to start? And now we've almost got the opposite problem, which is that nobody can pick up any momentum, in their individual performances because there's so many changes. And, I was having a conversation with someone earlier about, our goalkeeper, Lisa Kopp, who I feel like has been probably the best out of our January transfers so far. And she's kind of grown on me a bit, but I'm not like totally convinced. But, my friend Rachel was explaining that she's had to deal with having different center back duo in front of her like almost every game. So that surely is not helping. And I think for the most part, the goals we've been conceding have not been her fault, really. So it's just a matter of the team really struggling to find any sort of chemistry. And, that goes for the attack too. It's like on my other podcast, we've been doing this running joke of, who's going to be the next player not named Beth England to score. And at this point, I think it might be just Beth England when she gets back.
Eventually, hopefully. Only 5 games left, as you said, but hopefully that is the case. Yeah, you mentioned the January signings too. Obviously, one of those was Josephine Rybrink, who had the own goal today. A little unlucky on it. I mean, people will look at a 2-0 scoreline and think that this was just non-existent. Spurs, I was a little bit more positive coming out of this result. We were chatting this morning in our WhatsApp chat. Like, I was a little bit more positive just because I thought that Spurs did play this match on the front foot. I wish that it was easier to find Scott's favorite stat, expected goals, for women's football in the world right now, because I feel like that number would have been a little even, maybe even tilting in the favor of Spurs in this match, just because they were on the front foot. There were multiple opportunities to score, multiple, just chances in the box to put a goal home, and the finishing just was not there. We saw late on, Suminen had a really, really good free kick that clanged off the post that almost bent in. There were multiple opportunities, and they just didn't come. And the own goal came in the 16th minute, and the first 15 minutes were really, really positive. And once the own goal came, you kind of saw some shoulders drop, and it took a little bit for Spurs to kind of get back into the game. But by the end of the match, they kind of had, and you thought that equalizer was coming. The second goal came literally right at the precipice of extra time, right in the 90th minute. And it was kind of, honestly, I don't know how that goal got through. It looked like 12 different people it might have clanged off of and into the goal. But it was, I feel a little bit exasperated talking about Spurs women at this point, because the results are obviously not there, but I'm seeing some stuff that looks positive, but it's just not, the circuits are not all connecting right now. And there's definitely a disconnect when it comes to the attack without Beth England. Beth England, when she's on the pitch, is able to literally drag the other 10 players with her to something, but it still hasn't quite been enough. I do think that the one positive we can say is that, we are seeing Ilya Morris like really become a player. And that's like something. The last couple of weeks, we've seen really, really positive performances from her. Other than that, I think that it's nice seeing Martha Thomas put in a good shift as well, because we haven't really seen her get going as well. But like, there's just not enough oomph right now. And I think your point about the center backs too, Caroline, like the chopping and changing of defense has led to just a lack of continuity at this point of the season. And at this point of the season is when you would think you should be humming toward the finish, but it just has not gone that way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, that's where some of my frustration with the manager lies, in the sense that it feels like he's between two minds of wanting to try to get out the best team in some games to get a result. And then in other games, he seems more focused on looking to the future, developing, those future players that we think are going to be important down the line. But it's just a situation where nobody seems to have any confidence. The end product has not been there. And even today, I was just picking up on, little things like the body language of the players, like the substitutes who were getting ready to come on the pitch just didn't look energized, motivated. And, I do think some of that comes down to Robert. Like that is part of his job, to motivate the players. But I can see it from the other perspective too, that he has also not been set up for success with some of the transfer business, because I really don't think either of our transfer windows this season have been anything to write home about. It looks like Olivia Holt could be a great player, but as you always say, availability is the best ability, and she has
to be number one. Yeah, it has to be number one. So, yeah. Scott, I know you haven't, obviously, with a lot going on in your world, you haven't gotten the chance to like dive in and watch the games as much lately. But just from your perspective, with like taking it from a macro sense, with Robert Villahamn, where are you at? Because I'm not ready to pull the plug, but I don't want to put so much on these final 5 games of the season, but I feel like I want to see something from him. What's your thought right now on just the direction of where this team is?
Yeah, I think we talked about it 3 or 4 episodes ago a little bit, and I'm probably going to end up mimicking what I said during that show. But ultimately, I don't think Robert has earned the equity that that Ange has on the men's side, and I find myself kind of comparing the two situations because I do think they're similar. I think at this point, I also take into account that there's probably a little bit of a higher expectation on the men's side than there is on the women's side, and I think that factors in, right? I would say if you look at where both the men's and women's team are, I would say that from a league perspective, at least, the men's team is underperforming in a greater sense than the women's team is. And again, that's the expectation piece, right? But I don't think I've seen really much of anything from Robert throughout his tenure that leads me to think this is the best long-term option. And I could be wrong. I'm just a fan, right? Other than the FA Cup run last year, which managers find cup runs, right? And I think that's more of a personality management piece than it is like a tactical management piece, right? When it comes to a cup run, it's really all about getting the players mentally ready for everything to come down to 90 minutes, right? As opposed to a season. So, I think at this point, I would put my, chips in the basket of Robert probably not being around long term. And so I don't know really where that leaves us, but ultimately I don't think we're going to get better under him, unfortunately. And I also think that the way that he's making his selections when it comes to the teams he's putting out leads me to believe he's feeling quite a bit of pressure. I really don't think managers change teams and chop teams as much as he is, unless they know their job's on the line and they're just kind of trying to throw shit at the wall and seeing what sticks, right, to maybe find some form. And of course, Beth being out really doesn't help. But at this point, I don't think Robert is the future of the women's team, unfortunately.
And for me, Caroline, I'm curious how much you would agree with this. For me, it kind of unfortunately starts above Robert. And that's why I feel like I'm still giving him a little bit more leeway, just because there's you mentioned it, Scott, like the recruitment, the technical director, whatever you want to call it, is not fully in place for this squad to be able to be built like Arsenal, City, United, any of these teams, any of these big teams in the WSL. And I think that the WSL is growing at a pace that Tottenham Hotspur is not growing at this point. Like the WSL is, we've heard it from a number of American players on the women's side talking about, hey, I might not be long for staying in the NWSL here in the States. I might be wanting to get over and play in Europe at some point, whether it's in England or just Europe writ large. Like that part of the women's game is growing. And I am not 100% sure that Tottenham Hotspur is growing its women's program at the same pace that the women's game in Europe is growing overall. And that starts higher than Robert for me. So while it's not been good enough, I also don't fully put it on him. And may that come at the expense of his job? It might, but I don't know what kind of cycle that puts you back into if you're not actually investing in the product itself.
Right. And, I think Scott is right to compare the situation with the men's team because, Ange is kind of in the same boat where, he's now been getting the results, but we think the club should probably stick with him for the time being because they have started to change things behind the scenes on the men's side so that they're, getting better recruitment processes, all these kind of things that are going to lead to success, not as immediately as we would like, but at least the foundation is being built. And I feel like with Spurs Women, we are so many years behind the curve compared to other teams in the league. And, even if you look at something like the club scheduling this Legends game on the same day as the Spurs Women match when they had a perfectly free Saturday instead, it just shows they're not really a priority at the club, unfortunately. And, we hear talk that they are changing some things at the administrative level on the women's side. Like we're supposed to be getting a new sporting director in, although we've still not heard anything definitive on who that's going to be. They just parted ways with the general manager because they want to change how that role functions. So, I think there are some plans to change things, but it's, definitely a case of too little too late in terms of keeping pace with some of the other teams. Even if you look at like a Brighton, who I think are being a little more ambitious in that regard. Or even Everton, who are finally getting it together now that they have some actual funds for investment. So yeah, it's just tough because it feels like we're going to be in the painful rebuild for longer than we need to be, perhaps.
Yeah, I just, as harsh as it is to say, it's actually not harsh. It's just, it's maybe going to seem sensationalist to say this, even though I don't think any of the three of us feel this way. But I think on the women's side, Levy just doesn't see enough ROI to invest in the squad. I don't think he sees it as the money-making machine that the men's team is, and that's why we see the lack of investment, which is piss poor and super disappointing, right? I've said it how many times on the show. Levy could easily break women's football with the snap of a finger if he wanted to do so. And yeah, he hasn't done that. Not that I want the sport broken, but I think you all understand the point, right? Like,
well, but
the
breaking
Neymar
it in a good way.
Yeah, like the
it's
Neymar
almost,
transfer broke men's football. He could easily do that on the women's side. I mean, Kermit just went for $1 million, and that's literally pocket change to Tottenham Hotspur. So.
Yeah, and I think, you look at a team like Arsenal, who ostensibly should be our rival on the women's side as well. Like, we're nowhere near them, obviously, in reality. But they were a club who acted as a leader in women's football, and they put the investment in early, and now they are seeing those dividends. So it's a willingness to make that initial investment that it doesn't seem like Levy is willing to put that much into. And, it shows, like we've talked about many times, in terms of Beth England still being our record transfer, several seasons later. And those American players who are, interested in joining the WSL, I don't think we're looking at them because our recruitment structure is not there.
No.
And, I think that's kind of an issue across the board in women's football. Like, the recruiting infrastructure is not where it needs to be. And there's some interesting reporting on that in The Athletic recently that I recommend. But yeah, it's got to be better. And if they don't have the will to make it better, then I don't know, it's going to be tough.
And unless Spurs are getting, Alex Morgan for a loan where she's essentially just rehabbing following pregnancy, like, I don't think that, like, that's the high watermark, or Beth England. Like, and that's no slight to Beth England whatsoever. Like, Beth England coming here was a coup, and it was a great signing, but, like, you can't just have one of those over the course of 3 seasons. Like, you've got to do them all the time to continue to build. And Caroline, you mentioned teams like Everton, teams like West Ham, even Brighton. I think you could throw Liverpool into that mix, even though Liverpool, from a stature standpoint, are bigger than those other clubs. Like, those are the teams that Spurs should be scrapping and clawing with and fighting to get to that next mark. We've talked about this over the last couple of seasons. Right now, Spurs are looking up at all of those clubs because they've let this thing very quickly get stagnant, and we know things can get stagnant quickly if you're not continuing to grow it. But Scott, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. Caroline makes a good point too. There is a power shift happening, and it's painful to say as an American, right, and a fan of NWSL, but there is a power shift, I think, starting to roll from the NWSL to the WSL. And players are talking about Champions League and everything that it offers, right? And I think if Spurs aren't careful, they're going to get absolutely left in the dust and end up relegated in the somewhat near future as that power shift continues to happen, because the best NWSL players are going to end up in the WSL. And as we've talked about extensively at this point, none of us feel strongly that any of them will wind up at Spurs at this point, right? And that's just is going to be problematic for Tottenham. And that's where I say in the near future, I could see us facing relegation if we don't get our act together pretty quickly.
Well, it's interesting you bring up relegation, because that's what we're going to talk about next. But before we do, I do want to remind everyone to head on over to digitalspurs.com for your latest Tottenham merch. We are delighted to be partnered up with Digital Spurs this year. It's artwork that's put to different merch. We're talking hoodies, t-shirts, crew necks, hats like the one you see me wearing right now, which does not say the name of a golf brand. That says Tottenham, even though it looks like it says the name of a golf brand, which I'm not going to give any attention to. Digital Spurs has all kinds of different stuff. Danny Garris puts this stuff together, and we love them. Head on over to digitalspurs.com for your latest, and let them know that we here at the Tottenham Depot sent you. You brought up relegation, Scott, and it's a perfect segue into our next segment, because we were going to talk about this whole idea that the WSL is considering scrapping promotion and relegation. The League Cup is potentially on the chopping block as well. There's a lot of this stuff going on, and I want to point to Caroline, because Caroline, for those who don't know, Caroline does a really good newsletter, Spurs Across the Pond, and has spelled a lot of this stuff out. And your recent issue that you put out really went through like all the different arguments about promotion relegation throughout the women's game. There's a lot of different opinions. They're mostly, I would say, probably 75% side of no, we don't want promotion and relegation scrapped. I would have to say there's a lot of different voices in on this, but Caroline, take us to like why this argument is happening, who's proposing it. Give us the skinny for those who haven't really been paying that much attention.
Yeah, so the WPLL is the new organization that's running the WSL and the Women's Championship. They took over from the FA at the beginning of this season. And they've kind of come in with this attitude of, we're going to shake things up. We're going to do things differently. We're going to target new audiences, et cetera. So one of the things that they've targeted is that they want to expand the leagues, which I feel like most people are in favor of, as a basic, principle. Like, we know that there aren't enough games for a lot of teams like Tottenham who are not in European competition. So I think that would be a positive. However, there's some concern about the way that they want to go about it, which is to essentially pause relegation. I won't say scrap, even though that's kind of been the term that's been going around, because the proposal I think that's on the table right now is that they're going to pause it for a few seasons to, only have promotion, so that the leagues are going to expand. And I think ultimately the goal was to have them both be at 16 teams. And then they say after that point, relegation is going to come back. But I think a lot of people are feeling nervous that, once the relegation has gone away for a while, the owners are going to think, oh, this is nice. We don't have to worry about getting relegated. We don't have to invest into the team. And so there's some concern that they're not actually going to go back to how it has been. But they've also been making the argument that, without relegation, it will spur investment. I think common sense says the complete opposite, frankly.
I would agree with you.
We've kind of seen it, a perfect case example with Tottenham in recent seasons. It was only that time when we were really close to getting relegated that they finally splashed the cash on Beth England. And otherwise, it's been pretty unambitious from Tottenham. Yeah. So, that's a concern. There's also concerns about what this is going to mean for lower down in the pyramid. If they don't bring back relegation after these few seasons, it's essentially a semi-closed league, and there's concern about, how are the lower division teams going to get investment from their owners if they don't have realistic prospects of getting up there to the top league. So yeah, there's a lot going on.
Well, and it feels a lot like what on the men's side happened a few years ago with the European Super League talks. And I feel as if there was enough pushback then to kind of like make all of the owners, including Daniel Levy, like cower in fear of, oh no, what's going to happen if we actually go through with this? This feels similar, but it doesn't feel like there's nearly as much hubbub about this. Obviously, this is still just in the early stages. It's not like this is coming in next season, but even this whole discussion, it just feels, I mean, you said it, it feels very closed. The League Cup also being potentially axed. I don't know the point of that. And, Scott, we've seen announcements just this week that there's other leagues around the world, including right here in the United States. The USL is going to be eventually moving to a system of promotion and relegation in an effort to challenge MLS. So, like, at least that, in my mind, that's what it is. They didn't outwardly say that, obviously, but that's what it is. They're trying to expand their footprint, make the game more accessible to lower level clubs who can work their way up. That feels like the heart of the game. In essence, it feels like the grassroots of it. So tell me why this would be a good idea for this to happen in the women's game. I can't see it.
Yeah, there is no good answer to that question. The long and the short of it, in my opinion, is they believe that it will create a more lucrative product at the very top at the expense of the rest of the pyramid. And they're perfectly fine with that because they're just money hungry and greedy. And that's how the world works, right? The Women's Super League, if you scrap relegation, will improve without a doubt. Teams will be set. They will invest more money into their teams. They will grow in strength. It will become more competitive. But again, the rest of the pyramid dies in the process, in my opinion. And that's just unacceptable and not okay. I think it's an apt comparison to talk about the Super League for sure. But if this goes through, it's really, really, really disappointing and quite representative of the greater conversation we've been having about investment into women's soccer in general. Yeah, and then on the USL side, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think we talk a lot about how in England, there's a team everywhere, right? Little towns have teams and they can go up and down, and it could be that in an exponential sense here in the United States, right? There could be so many teams competing for opportunities to grow their presence. I live in Des Moines, Iowa. The Des Moines Menace have been a team in Iowa for as long as I can remember. I went to games in middle and high school all the time, not all the time, but enough, right? And I think part of why the Des Moines Menace play in a small high school stadium and get very little turnout is because they're in the lowest division of USL, right? And I'm just going to say it, right? I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Going to those games is pretty underwhelming at this point. It just doesn't have that feel of professional soccer at all, right? So you really got to be like a hardcore junkie to go watch those games. And all power to those who do, right? I can't say that I've been to one in the last year, but if the Des Moines Menace have the prospect of getting promoted into USL 1 and then the championship, I'm telling you right now, a lot more people from Des Moines are going to go to those matches. And anyways, it's fantastic. So to tie it all back together, the fact that the Women's Super League wants to go in the other direction at a time when women's sports is growing rapidly across the globe, right? Basketball here in the U.S., it's March Madness. Tons of that is seen right now in the women's basketball game, right? I think this year brackets are busted everywhere, and it's because there is parity in women's basketball, right? That there hasn't ever been before. It was typically you'd select your bracket and 1 and 2 seeds went all the way to the Final Four, and that was kind of how it worked, right? Because there was no parity in investment, and we're seeing that now. So again, not a basketball pod, but on the soccer side, the same thing is happening, and it's just wild to me that the WSL would make this decision at that time. But we talked about just a few minutes ago why that was, and it's driving revenue at the top of the pyramid and letting the rest die in the process.
Well, and we know that you've been talking about going to the Des Moines Menace Open Cup game coming up, and why is that? Because it's a game with actual stakes. So
100%, 100%.
I feel like that's a lot of the feedback I'm hearing from, especially people in the UK who are obviously way more intensely invested in this than we are, that they feel like removing the relegation just goes against like their complete sporting tradition. And we obviously could have a different perspective as Americans because we've watched closed leagues, and we know there are ways to make them compelling and to keep the storylines going season to season, but it is different. And just to tie it back to the European Super League thing too, I feel like the reason that got so much pushback at the fan level is because there was a lot of reporting about it, frankly. Like I don't know about y'all, but on the sort of sports media that I consume, it's been pretty quiet about this, relegation scrapping situation. Scott was saying before we recorded that, he really never hears about women's football on the shows that he watches, except for like Galazzo on CBS. They're really the only ones we can think of who cover it consistently.
Well,
so
I mean, this goes to the point, and while I'll continue to tell people to go subscribe to Spurs Across the Pond because Caroline does such a good job of presenting this stuff, I learned about the promotion relegation thing from your newsletter. Like it didn't cross my nose before I read about it there, because you do such a great, and I'm not trying to like sit here and just pump your tires the whole time, but like you do such a good job of curating this stuff for people who do want to be informed and do want to know about it, even down to as simple as if you're an American, you want to know what channel to turn on to watch a game. Like you've got that in there. If this whole thing was going to come with like a uniform television deal and the money was going to come all from that, like maybe that's where you would think about it. But there's not even that. There's not even uniformity in that. Most of the WSL games, other than, the select few, most of them are just put up on YouTube, on a YouTube stream. Like if there's a money element to this, because all of our, problems are solved with money, obviously, in the world of sports and sports business. Like if that was the case, I would get it. But the fact that they're just discussing this without even the guarantee of anything like that is baffling to me. So it doesn't pass the smell test. And you're right. The light that needs to be shown on it is not bright enough, in my opinion. And that's part of the problem. I know there's a lot of people out there who do this kind of stuff. I know you featured in your newsletter. Ian Wright's one of them. Like he's one of the big names who like does talk about this stuff, but more people need to be doing it. So I don't know. I didn't mean to come on here and praise Ian Wright either, but my God, that's where we are to this point. It's kind of tough. And anything else you guys need? Any other shots you guys need to get off about this before we move on? Because I do want to talk about Mauricio Pochettino for some ungodly reason today.
Yeah, I will just say, just to kind of expand on what Caroline mentioned earlier, I have gone off social media 3 months ago now, probably, right? Just deleted it from my devices. It's been fantastic if anyone's ever exploring making that decision, right? It's been pretty great. But the one thing that has been a detriment, we could say at this point, is not having women's soccer fed to me through my Twitter feed. I aggregate everything into my Apple News feed, right? And I'm sure there's FOTMob and there's other ways to aggregate sources and information, right? But on the men's side, from a Spurs perspective, right, I get pumped everything through my aggregator. It's match times. I could learn about what happened at training 3 days ago, who ate what for breakfast at training, right, on the men's side. And on the women's side, I'm not exaggerating when I say this. If I pull up my Spurs Women aggregator, it's Chelsea, Arsenal, and Man City stories filtered into like the last time we played them. So Spurs played Man City 2 weeks ago, and here's a story about Bunny Shaw, right? Is pretty much what I see. And so it's disappointing, to say the least, right? To really have to go super out of my way to make sure that match times are in front of me and I'm getting the news sources that I need without Twitter, without Instagram, right? So I think, and again, social media and the problems it creates probably plays into this issue in itself, right? I think if we didn't just depend on social media for our news sources, right, I think this would probably be less of a problem, but that's a whole nother conversation in itself. And my point is that women's football just simply does not get enough coverage outside of a Twitter feed, and that's disappointing. So,
well, someone who is getting a lot of coverage this week, Mauricio Pochettino, and I hesitate to even bring up his name at sometimes because of just my feelings. But Mauricio Pochettino, of course, is now the manager of the U.S. men's national team, and this week ahead of their match against, remind me, Panama again. Is it this team lost again to Panama? That's what it was. For those who are unaware, I've pretty much checked out of the U.S. men's team. I'll watch on occasion, but my goodness, I'm so glad I did not watch that the other night. But Mauricio Pochettino had some comments about one day wanting to return to Tottenham and how he still talks to Daniel Levy regularly. Just regular unabashed Argentinian flirtation going on with this man right now. Scott, I know you're probably batting your eyes and enjoying it and like, spraying your cologne on and preparing yourself for Pochettino to joyfully return. But what did you make of the hubbub over Poch this week? Because for me, it was just, you can hear it in my voice. I'm kind of just over it at this point. I'm kind of very annoyed, but I know that you are like you were a number one before Ange got here. You were a number one. Bring Poch back. I want to know what you think about this week. A man who is leading your country into a World Cup next year on home soil is flirting with coming back to Spurs.
Look, I'll say a few things. First of all, I do think it's probably just hubbub, and I think Levy and Poch are probably still buddies and had breakfast together or whatever it was. And then
I don't even know if that was real, by the way. There were photographs being posted all over social media.
Knows, right?
That did get to me, but like, was that AI? Like, was that doctored? Did that happen last week? Did it happen 3 years ago? I don't know. So
it could very well have been doctored. So yes, it's at this point, it's just hubbub anyways, right? The second thing I'll say, as a fan of the U.S. men's national team, hands off Poch. And frankly, if I'm Poch, I'm not walking away from managing a country in a home World Cup. Granted, the Panama result was just atrocious. I don't think we actually played that poorly. We just didn't take any chances, right? But nonetheless, you don't walk away from managing the U.S. into a home World Cup in 18 months or 14 months. Actually, it just doesn't make any sense, right? On the other side of things, I do still believe that Poch is a very good option for Spurs. I think, and I know people will disagree with me, but I do think that when it comes to getting a group of young talent to punch above their weight, I don't think there's many that are better than him. And I think where we're at in our project is very similar to where we were at when he found success in 15 and 16. The year Leicester won the title, a young squad with a couple elder statesmen, key pieces like a Romero, for example, right? I liken that to like a Toby Alderweireld or something, a Jan Vertonghen potentially. But I think the pieces are in place for Poch to come in and work his magic. And I think Spurs have just honestly been an utter mess since they sacked him. And it may be time for Levy to just, again, admit the error of his ways and go back to something that worked really, really well. Granted 8 years ago now at this point, but I just believe that there's very few people who can get the current squad we have now to punch above its weight. And so we can, let's say hypothetically Ange is sacked, which I will say if we crash out of the Europa League, I do think he will be, and I won't be upset about that. But if Ange is sacked hypothetically, we can bring in a number of project managers, but we're going to have to accept that it's probably not going to be the product that we want to see for another 2 to 3 years. And I think Poch is maybe the one guy who can shorten the length of that process. And then of course, this is all coming from a place of bias for me because I still haven't felt that love and desire and passion for Spurs that I have since he left. And I probably just want to fall in love with Spurs like I was prior to him being sacked. Right. I think that, and it wasn't like Poch didn't get me there, right? But ever since he was sacked, and it's probably because we went the Mourinho and Conte route, but I just again haven't felt that passion that I did under Poch since he left, and I'd probably just like to have that back too, if I'm being honest.
So before I go to Caroline, because I know you got to get out of here shortly, and Caroline and I may carry on this conversation briefly after you depart, but I guess everything you just said, like, the only thing that doesn't make sense to me still is timeline, because you don't want Pochettino to leave the U.S. men's national team ahead of the World Cup, which is next season. But if Ange gets sacked after this season, there's a gap there. So where is this circle being squared, if you will?
Don't ask me the tough questions, man. Come on.
That's what I mean. Like it feels if Pochettino is out of a job right now, I would totally get it. I would get why this is all bubbling up to the surface again. But the fact that he has accepted not only an international role, but an international role with a nation that's going to be hosting the damn thing, a nation that obviously we are all a part of, for better or for worse. Like that to me, the emotion of this and the complication of it just is exponentially that much more elevated. So where does all this fit?
Yeah, I mean, if and I'm not saying this is your question, but I'm just posing hypothetically, if the question were, would you prefer Poch manage the Spurs or the US? I would say Spurs in real time. I think Spurs are more important to me than the US men's national team. If I truly thought we could win the World Cup, I maybe have a different answer here, but I don't believe that's possible right at this point in time. I think it is in the future for sure, but I don't believe it's happening in 2026 as Caroline raises her Germany badge. And honestly, Germany would be my hands-on favorite to win next summer's World Cup for sure, without a doubt. They're very talented, and Nagelsmann has them humming in a way that they haven't hummed since 2010, maybe, dare I say. And so, yeah, anyways.
Maybe the year we won, but yeah.
Yeah. Wait, would you guys win in 14?
Yes.
14, yeah. So 14, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I would prefer he manages Spurs. I mean, I said it in the group chat, I manage Spurs and a national team all the time in Football Manager, constantly. It's easy.
I think it's a little different.
Yeah, I mean,
just slightly different.
You don't have to catch flights and stuff to be in two places at once or whatever, right? You just click next email. But at the same time, why not? Let's roll the dice and see what happens. But no,
for new listeners, I just want to make it clear that is not baby brain that Scott is speaking with. That is just Scott right there. That's perfect. Thank you for that.
Roll the dice. Let him manage both. But no, honestly, what I really think is happening is Poch and Levy had dinner and the internet blew up. And I don't think Poch is leaving the men's national team. I don't think Poch is coming to Spurs. I don't even think And is going to get sacked. I think And is going to do some good things in the Europa League. And maybe there's a world where they're having a conversation about what if after the World Cup, right? Would you ever come back if we're going to give Ange another season and see what happens? But would there be interest? And we all know that there would be, right? He's come out and said that. He answered that question for us. But right now, I really think that just two buddies had lunch and the internet blew up because of it is my take.
Caroline, are you ready for perhaps the most invasive question I've ever asked you on the podcast or otherwise? Have you ever thought about going back to an ex? Because that's pretty much what this feels like to me. Like that's where we're at, right?
Yeah, I won't touch that part of it, but the one thing that Scott said that I have to quibble with just briefly is the idea that Romero is going to be an elder statesman in this supposed future. I still don't think he's going to be at the club next season.
I don't either. But Pochettino would go a long way to keeping him here, obviously, with the Argentina ties. But I don't think that's happening either. Obviously, yes, I would agree with you.
That's true. Yeah, something I think you and I were talking about is that if he were to Pochettino, that is, were to leave the U.S. so prematurely and come back to Spurs, that would kind of leave a bad taste in our mouth. But I also feel like I really don't care to see Pochettino return. I've admitted this many times, but one of my worst qualities as a sports fan is that I hold grudges, and I feel like he can't get the Chelsea off of him at this point. So yeah, for me, it's a no. And I just don't think it seems that realistic, at least not in the short term, like we've said. I think that for better or worse, they're going to stick with Pochettino at the U.S. team for a while, and at least give him through the World Cup, unless we really, really tank in the next few months, which is possible because, like Scott said, I don't feel confident in that team at all.
Yeah, it's definitely possible.
There's a lot of weaknesses. There's a lot of holes in the squad. There's, Gio Reyna's club situation, etc.
I do get the allure somewhat, though, of a Pochettino returning to Spurs when you talk about that squad. Like when you talk about the youth that is now in this team, it's not all that dissimilar to what Pochettino built up. It's actually, I would say, a little bit. I mean, would you consider this current squad in its state, especially with the youth and the young players? I would consider it probably slightly better even than the Champions League team in 2019, just in terms of everything that surrounds it. Like I think there's room for growth with this club, obviously, and that's the type of team that you would want Pochettino to be able to come in and take over. Again, the timelines don't mesh, and I'm in a similar boat to you. I don't know that the grudge factor has worn off for me. Hell, I'm the same way with Harry Kane. Like there's all this talk about Harry Kane, go win your Bundesliga this year with Bayern, which obviously you're so close to being a Bayern supporter. And then maybe he can come back to Spurs next year. And I'm like, wait a second. I don't want that to happen. That feels gross to me. That feels like you're just like running him out and then bringing him back so that he gets some shine on him. I don't know. All of it just seems, it doesn't seem forward. It seems like you're taking a step back by doing something like that.
Right. And nostalgia is a nice thing, but it probably isn't very good for winning football games. And, I agree with you on Harry Kane. I really would not like to see him come back because, quite honestly, I think there was a time in his career, probably aligning with when Pochettino was at Spurs, that he was able to be a team player. I don't see that in him anymore. I think he's developed a bit of an ego, honestly, and it's an issue at Bayern. I see it every week.
It's an aura. He said it's not ego. He said it's an aura.
Sure, yeah, we'll go with that.
His aura has changed.
But I feel like one of the things I have liked about the Ange Postecoglou era at Spurs, which has not been perfect, we all know, but at least it feels like he's developing an actual team, and everybody can contribute. I don't like necessarily there being just that one superstar who's carrying the team, Beth England, because it doesn't work out, It
sure doesn't. And typically, look, it's not a universal truth that going back to your ex never works out. But we know that there's a reason that people talk about it like that's never going to work out. And it just feels like a Mauricio Pochettino return would be, to me, it would be a step back. Like it would be dipping back into, it would be an admission to me that Daniel Levy just has no answers either. Like it would be that kind of he would be succumbing to what everyone wants him to do just because, of feelings. And like you said, nostalgia and nostalgia doesn't win football games it's the line of the episode. It's perfect.
Well, and honestly, I think a lot of people have concerns that Pochettino's tactics have not evolved with the times, and we might be seeing that playing out with the US currently. So yeah, I don't think it's a good idea. And I just want to clarify for the record that was not a slight at Beth England. That was a slight at Spurs Women.
Yeah, no, it's a slight at, you can't just center yourself around one player. Like you can't do that. You have to build out a team. And yeah. And to your point on Pochettino, if he can't do it against Panama on a Thursday night in March, how's he going to do it against
Chelsea at Stamford Bridge,
or Stoke on a rainy Tuesday? like what do you, like the old cliche? Like it's all the same type of boat. So I'm kind of out on the idea of Poch, but if it happens, I'm gonna eventually fall back in love. But again, the timelines don't match for me whatsoever. It doesn't make any damn sense. And I'm still wanting to see this out with Ange right now, and that's kind of where we're at. We still have it's weird. We've been on an international break on the men's side. We still have a week and a half before they play another game because Spurs are not involved in the FA Cup next weekend, so we will not have a men's game to talk about. They don't play again until a week from Thursday, which is April the 3rd. Yes, the 3rd. So that's the next time we'll get to talk about the men's team. Obviously, we'll be back with you guys next week following the women's game away to Leicester, and I'm sure someone else will say something. Someone else will flirt with Spurs in some way or say something dumb, or hopefully, players stay healthy throughout the international break and don't, do anything stupid as we've seen in the past. Because anytime Spurs are away, we know that something dumb is bound to happen. So anything else you got to get off your chest before we move to wrap here? We don't have Todd to throw a curveball question at us today, but anything else you need to get off your chest?
Well, I think since Scott and I already kind of covered it, who do you think is going to win the World Cup?
I would lean to Germany as well. But honestly, it's so damn early. Like it feels, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how checked out I've been on international football just in the last handful of seasons. I'm actually watching way more women's international football than men's. I talked about it on the pod, but I went a few weeks ago and saw the She Believes Cup when it was here in Arizona. I've invested in the Emma Hayes project for certain. I think she's doing yeoman's work in getting the squad back up to where it needs to go after a slight dip. But on the men's side of things, I've just been so checked out. Germany, though, yeah. Spain, I'm sure they'll be good. I know Scott's struggling with Italy right now a little bit, but Italy's damn good. We all know that. There's a lot of and by the way, Argentina still exists. Like they're going to be good. We all know that. But it's still the World Cup. I know it is only a little over a year away, but that still just seems so far for me to even start to prognosticate on that. But yeah, I would certainly lean Germany, as I'm sure most people would at this point of the calendar. So a lot of time before then and now. We'll I'm sure we will. If the pod will still be going then, and we will be talking about it because it's going to be here in this country and obviously in Mexico and Canada as well. So there's going to be a lot of, I'm sure some of us are going to try and get to games and all of that, even if it's just in the build-up. So a lot going on in the coming years. That's going to do it for this edition of the Tottenham Depot. Be sure to check out our episodes on our YouTube page, youtube.com/Tottenham Depot. Couldn't be easier for you to find there. Also, be sure to leave us a rating and review on your podcast app of choice to help spread the word about the show. You can follow Karen at Jeffka. You can follow me at Jeffka. Even though, like Scott, I am mostly off social media for the most part. He is at Scott G. Bird. And again, follow us at Tottenham Depot on all the platforms. We are there. We'll talk to you next week following that match against Leicester and whatever other news in the Spurs world comes about. We'll talk to you then. This has been the Tottenham Depot podcast. As always, come on, you Spurs.